Bonjour et bienvenue à l'ILARA, l'Institut des langues rares de l'École pratique des hautes études PSL. Hello and welcome to ILARA, our institute, whose aim is to showcase the rare and precious ancient and contemporary languages of the world. Today's roundtable will be in English, but I'll introduce our institute in French first. L'ILARA est un institut créé en août 2020 par arrêté du ministère français de l'Enseignement supérieur, de la Recherche et de l'Innovation. Sa mission est de sensibiliser et former le grand public aux langues rares, anciennes et contemporaines, et à leur culture. Deux offres principales sont actuellement disponibles pour tous les publics. D'une part, une offre de cours d'initiation, de découverte et d'approfondissement en présentiel à Paris et en ce moment en visioconférence. Vous y trouverez par exemple des initiations au tikuna, langue amazonienne, au salar et au yogourt, langue autochtone minoritaire de Chine, ainsi qu'au louvite hiéroglyphique et au phrygien, langues anciennes d'Anatolie, entre autres. Et d'autre part, une offre de vidéoconférence virtuelle, l'ILARA en ligne, disponible sur notre chaîne, et dont la première série, les invitations de l'ILARA, met à l'honneur des spécialistes de renommée internationale sous forme d'entretiens, de conférences ou de tables rondes. Dans ce cadre de l'ILARA en ligne, nous avons accueilli d'abord 6 conférenciers et conférencières qui nous ont fait découvrir, continent par continent, des langues rares contemporaines du globe. Puis, nous nous sommes interrogés sur la pérennité des archives orales et ce qu'il est nécessaire de faire pour que les générations futures puissent garder accès à ce trésor de connaissances, tout comme nous pouvons encore, grâce aux traces écrites laissées par les civilisations anciennes, avoir accès à une partie de leur culture. Ces langues anciennes ont été l'objet des 2 dernières conférences qui portaient sur les glyphes mayas et sur les graphies du hittite. Toutes ces conférences sont encore disponibles sur notre chaîne si vous souhaitez les visionner à nouveau. Nous revenons à présent au XXIe siècle. Nous voulions à l'ILARA aborder plusieurs questions importantes qui concernent les langues rares sous forme de table ronde. La première de ces thématiques est le multilinguisme à petite échelle, qui caractérise quantité de sociétés rurales du monde. Au sein de celles-ci, les locuteurs, femmes, hommes et enfants, sont des polyglottes qui s'expriment au quotidien dans plusieurs langues locales. Pour coordonner ce thème très riche du multilinguisme en langue rare, nous avons invité la professeure Friederike Lüpke et lui avons donné carte blanche. Elle a choisi de décliner cette question en 2 tables rondes qui nous dévoileront les façons dont communiquent ces polyglottes en langue rare. L'une, co-organisée avec Ruth Singer, a lieu ce matin et concerne le monde Pacifique. L'autre aura lieu le 18 février et concernera le monde Atlantique. Friederike Lüpke est professeure d'études africaines à l'Université d'Helsinki depuis 2019. Elle était auparavant professeure de description et de documentation linguistique à la SOAS de Londres, où elle est toujours chercheure associée. Elle travaille depuis de nombreuses années au Sénégal, où elle a documenté et analysé plusieurs langues mandées et atlantiques. Et s'est intéressée aux pratiques d'écriture, notamment à travers les projets Crossroads et Liliema qu'elle a initiés et dont elle vous parlera sans doute. Très engagée dans l'étude des pratiques socio-historiques et linguistiques des petites communautés multilingues, elle est l'une des pionnières de ce domaine d'études émergent dont elle explore brillamment les problématiques. Je vous invite maintenant à découvrir ce passionnant multilinguisme avec Friederike, Ruth et leurs invités. N'hésitez pas à leur poser vos questions, en français ou en anglais, à travers le chat en direct. Welcome to you all, and please ask your questions in the live chat, share your comments and participate. This roundtable is also yours. Friederike, we're very happy to welcome you to ILARA. Many thanks for accepting our invitation to convene this double roundtable on small-scale multilingualism and for preparing such an exciting program. Many thanks and welcome as well to your co-convener Ruth Singer and your panelists. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup Amina et merci beaucoup à ILARA pour l'invitation et aussi pour cette introduction très gentille. Thank you very much Amina and ILARA, which is such an important initiative to put small languages, their speakers and their linguistic ecologies into the spotlight. And I'm delighted and feel really honored to have been given the opportunity to organize 2 roundtables, and I could have organized, well, not me personally, because my perspective is limited, but it would have been completely possible to organize 10 roundtables on this topic, because small-scale multilingualism, our topic of today, is actually a very widespread language ecology in the world. And it is ironic that when we think of multilingualism and we think of polyglots, we have certain images in our head, you know, maybe a bearded professor writing his 10th grammar, or, you know, a YouTuber telling the world how they managed to learn Greek in 10 weeks. But very few people would actually think about somebody living in a rural area of Vanuatu or Northern Australia. And this misconception is really blatant. And we are very grateful, I think, all the panelists for today's roundtable and for the one next week, that we've been given the opportunity to correct this view of multilingualism as something that actually belongs to the modern world. We hear a lot that multilingualism is on the increase, whereas in fact, in our panel, the impression is that actually multilingualism, the multilingualism that has been lived for as far as history, you know, is known, is threatened by nationalism and by monolingual attitudes. And today we focus on one particular world region. And since this is not the world region I work on, I have invited Ruth Singer to be the co-convener and co-host. I've known Ruth, I think, for 7 years now, when she reached out to me because we were both starting to work on small-scale multilingualism in a more comparative perspective. And we have established a regular exchange since then. So Ruth is one of the pioneers of this emerging field of small-scale multilingualism research that looks at very local forms of multilingualism, mainly in societies in the global south, where individual speakers, through the social relationships that they maintain, have highly complex multilingual repertoires. So Ruth has worked on multilingualism in Northern Arnhem, and she currently is at the University of Melbourne, where she is an ARC Future Fellow with a really ambitious project, Hearing the Futures, looking at the evolution of linguistic diversity, and I guess both looking back, but also looking at predictions and trajectories. And now I give the floor to Ruth to introduce today's panelists and their settings.
Thanks, Friederike. Just to start with, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where I'm speaking, the Wurundjeri people of Naarm or Melbourne, and their language Woiwurrung. Some of the framing of the discussion we're having today comes out of conversations I had with Indigenous Australian linguist Leslie Woods. So I'd just like to thank her for those conversations. Unfortunately, she couldn't participate in the panel today. So I'm going to introduce the panel members one by one, just briefly mention their work. If you want to know more about them, there's more extensive bios on the ILARA website, which you can have a look at. First of all, Christian Döhler is at the Leibniz Center for General Linguistics, SAS, in Berlin. He's an expert in documentation and description of the languages of Southern New Guinea. And he's very interested in understanding how small-scale multilingualism creates a context in which these languages can flourish. I'll show you a map later where everybody's field sites are. Alex Francois is based at CNRS Paris, our second panel member, in the department Lattice. He works on the languages of Vanuatu, which has the highest number of languages per capita. And he would like to understand how it came to have these high levels of linguistic diversity. Our third panel member is Christina Gallego. She's assistant professor at the University of the Philippines, Diliman in Manila, and a PhD student at the Australian National University in Canberra. She looks at language contact between speakers of Ivatan and Ilocano on the small island community of Babuyan Claro in the far north of the Philippines. Last but not least is Jill Vaughan. She's based at the Research Unit for Indigenous Languages at the University of Melbourne, like I am. She researches dialectal variation and multilingual repertoires among speakers of Barara in the Maningrida region of Arnhem Land, a part of Arnhem Land in which 15 different languages are spoken. So I'm just going to hop over to a map which will show you the field sites. So you can see here Christina's field site up the top, and then where Christian does his research, Southern New Guinea. And here's Arnhem Land where Jill does her research, and Vanuatu in this region where Alex does his research. Thanks very much, Jill, for making the map. And I'll hand it back to Friederike.
Yes, so before we get into detailed discussions of the many different ways in which small-scale multilingual speakers use, maintain, adapt their repertoires and why they are so multilingual, we thought it would be really nice to paint a vivid picture of everyday multilingual life in the settings we're looking at today. And so I invite the panelists to share a little vignette of everyday linguistic life with us. And I would like to invite Christian to start.
Okay, so as you've seen, I work in Southern New Guinea, and more precisely, I work in a small village called Roku. The village language is called Komso, and there are around about 200 to 300 speakers. So basically, the inhabitants of one village are all the speakers. All those speakers grow up with at least 2 languages, because women usually marry in from another village. So in this sense, mother tongue and father tongue are different languages. And as a consequence, many languages can be heard in the village, and most children, of course, acquire more than those 2 languages. So an everyday scene might look a little bit like this. A speaker of Komso, even though she or he knows several languages, they will actually speak Komso most of the time. But that being said, she or he will have conversations with other people, and those other people might talk back in another language. So you do have something like a bilingual conversation, or if there are more people involved, you have sort of multilingual conversations. And this happens, of course, with those women who've married in, but also with visitors who come from other villages for a chat. So Roku is conveniently situated on what's called the Moorhead Highway. It's a very muddy road that connects the administrative town Moorhead with the villages further west. So you have, every day you have many people passing through Roku, and they stay for a chat with their friends. And in these conversations, the interactions will not accommodate. So they do not shift, or they rarely shift to a common language, but instead they remain loyal to their respective languages. And this is not an obstacle to successful communication, precisely because everyone is multilingual. Okay.
Thank you. So I take it then that although the village is associated with Komso as a language, that is because of some patrilineal concept of identity that is based on the identity of men who don't move. But that even those men are, of course, multilingual because they are being brought up by these women who came in. That's a very wonderful multilingual ecology. I wonder how it looks like in Jill's setting.
Thanks. So as Ruth mentioned, I work in the very north of Australia in a region called Arnhem Land, which is an Indigenous owned region. And so the information that I'll be talking about today is deeply indebted to the Indigenous people of the region, and I acknowledge their contributions to my own knowledge, as well as acknowledging that I'm also speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people and their language Woiwurrung. So on the central northern coast of this region is this community Maningrida, which is home to about 2,000 people, so quite a large community for the region. And just by way of a little bit of background for the everyday interaction I want to describe, over a dozen languages are spoken in this community every day. So about 12 Indigenous Australian languages, spanning 4 different language families and spanning one really significant linguistic border, with languages on either side as different as, say, English is from Hindi or Russian, for example. And there's also more recently developed contact languages, so local varieties of Aboriginal English, and also Creole, the language Kriol, Creole, which is a major Creole language spoken across Northern Australia. And so people here are very multilingual. That's the norm in the region, an average linguistic repertoire. So the languages an individual can speak and understand takes in at least 4 languages, but not uncommonly up to 7 or more languages. And so the interaction that I want to paint a picture of takes place at the local supermarket, a long-standing important place in the community called the Maningrida Progress Association. And it's an interesting context because it's an everyday place. Most community members are in and out of here a couple of times a week, if not more. And interactions are characterized by a great variety of choices and strategies. Interactions at the shop were actually first formally documented back in the 70s by linguist Vanessa Elwell. So I take a little bit of inspiration from her work and the shopkeeper that she depicted, Tommy Wokbara, but updated for the modern ecology. So Tommy is a Gunabidji man. He's a traditional owner of the land on which Maningrida stands. And Gunabidji people are in the minority among the current Maningrida community. So his first language is Njebana, which is the language of the Gunabidji people. And it's also the language which belongs to the local landscape of Maningrida in a very fundamental way. So the connection between language and territory is very, very strong here. It goes back to, for example, creation stories from the dream time and the mythic travels of ancestor spirits. And so people connect strongly with particular tracts of land and through that connection to the language associated with that particular tract of land. And so Tommy is very multilingual, even for Maningrida, along with his first language in Njebana. He also speaks several other traditional Australian languages from different language families. So he speaks Gunwingu, he speaks Gunbarlang, he speaks Maung, he speaks Nakara, and he has some knowledge of Barada as well as English. And so Tommy's behind the counter, he's serving customers, they're coming in and out. And I want to give you 3 examples of the interactions he has during a typical day and what choices are made in each one. So in his first interaction, Tommy chats with 25-year-old woman Betty, who is a Yolngu woman, and her first language is Bupapuengu. But she also speaks 4 other Indigenous languages and can understand 4 more beyond that, and also English. Because their repertoires only overlap at English and the language Barada, they speak Barada to each other. And this is a second or indeed a 6th language for both of them. And English is actually usually dispreferred in interaction between local folks. So in his second interaction, Tommy chats with 30-year-old Susan. Her first language is Barada. Tommy only speaks a little bit of Barada. And she also speaks in Njebana, which, if you recall, is Tommy's first language. The detail here is that Susan is married to Tommy's brother. And so they know a little bit about each other. And in the shop, they speak in Njebana, the language of Tommy and his family. And we can compare this interaction to another one with a customer who has the same linguistic repertoire, Barada and Njebana, and yet in that interaction, a different strategy is drawn on, where each of them draws on their own first language and they use sort of receptive multilingual communication. So the resultant choice is not always predictable, just from the linguistic repertoires of the interlocutors. And in the final interaction, Tommy chats to a Nakara man. Nakara is his first language, but he also speaks in Njebana, Tommy's language. And in their conversation, they code switch. So they use both languages, and in the middle of a sentence, they switch from one to the other. So as you can see, the shop's a very diverse space, but also a nice window into the complexity of how multilingual repertoires are deployed strategically in the dynamics of interaction, and that the motivations behind them are not always obvious to an outside observer.
Thank you, Jill, for this amazing vignette. It's really striking how it emerges that people's knowledge of each other and of their repertoire plays such a decisive role. And we often discuss whether the word, the term small-scale multilingualism is actually the apt term to characterize this type of multilingualism. And certainly it captures only one perspective, as all other terms do. So you could not reduce it, to just one dimension. But clearly this small local scale, and that people deeply care about relationships with each other and express that through their linguistic choices is really decisive. So I'm wondering how this plays out in Vanuatu. And of course, I don't expect a general answer because Vanuatu is itself tremendously internally diverse. But I hand over to Alex now.
Thanks, Friederike. Yeah, hello. Here's Alex from Paris. So I work at CNRS here in Paris, and my main field site is Vanuatu. Vanuatu is a small archipelago in terms of surface on the globe, but one which has a great number of languages, which we recently counted to be 138 languages for a small population of 0.28 million people. So this makes Vanuatu the country actually in the world with the highest linguistic density per capita, number of languages per capita, with an average, I mean, depending on what time frame, what time in the 20th century you're looking at, but something, at some points it went as low as 600 speakers per language on average. And then there was demographic change, which has also increased that average, that mean number. But so when I chose to go to Vanuatu for my PhD and my first explorations, we didn't know exactly that number of languages, but we knew it was known that the country was, rich with languages, and there were so many languages that were not described. So I went there with the idea, probably the naive idea, that if there were so many languages, that's because it was an archipelago, and basically each island had its own language, which is partly true. I mean, except of course you have some islands, just one island in Vanuatu can have 25 or 30 languages for the linguistically richest islands like Malekula. But with this idea in mind, I was not necessarily surprised to hear many languages already in the capital Vila, because capitals are capitals. So when I arrived to the town, to the city of Vila, which is obviously the first contact you have with the country, you hear lots of languages, a bit of French, a bit of English, mostly Bislama, which is this Creole, English-based Creole, which has become the vehicular language or lingua franca for the whole archipelago. But you also hear conversations in lots of languages which you don't recognize, but you can ask around, and some people will say, yeah, I'm from this southern island or this northern island, and so on. So I thought, okay, fair enough, the capital, the city, is going to be multilingual. But probably when I reach one of those islands, I'm going to be in a sort of monolingual setting, right? And which depend, in the island where I arrived first, it did give this feeling that everybody was speaking one language called Motlap around me. Every time I would say, I'm here to learn your language, and people would happily speak to me in Motlap, and for sometimes several days or weeks, I would mostly hear Motlap, except for the nurse or the teacher, or someone else who came from another island and spoke another language. But the more I lived in Vanuatu, and also in the in the next few years, when the following years, when I traveled around in other islands, especially smaller islands, the more I realized that actually languages, they're everywhere. I mean, it's not just what the teacher or the nurse or the priest who will come from other islands, but quite often a woman, will have married into the village from another village, and that's a sort of pattern of linguistic exogamy, which is quite actually a frequent pattern in Vanuatu. Sometimes it's the woman changing, the wife changes location. Sometimes it's the husband, So the more I discovered, or explored or lived in different families, the more I realized there were some villages and some families which were actually quite multilingual, to the point that in just one single family in Gawa, I remember hearing 4 different languages spoken the same day, because depending on if the teenagers were talking to their grandfather or their uncle or their grandmother, they would actually switch to different languages. The polyglossy, it was stunning. And just the last anecdote I remember is, especially in that village, I was going around with my mic asking for stories, traditional stories, or who wants to, and many people wanted to be recorded and say, I can, I have a story for you. And it happened several times that I would ask, okay, someone was interested to tell me a traditional story of the origin of the volcano or something. And then we would sit down and be ready to record. And then he asked me, okay, I can tell you this story in this language, in Merlap, in Lakon, or in Olrat, or if you want, in Nume. So you just pick your language. I was amazed. He actually told me different stories, each in a different languages. I was just amazed at the level of fluency that you can tell a full story fluently in languages which are actually quite different from each other. Yeah. So that's Vanuatu.
Thank you, Alex. I take 3 points that we will revisit, I think. So first of all, this tremendous diversity that we as outsider linguists coming from regularized, monolingualized settings are actually not very skilled to perceive from the outset. So because of our language-based outlook on linguistic description, we kind of apply a funnel when we work in these settings. And it takes some time actually, to open up, abandon the tunnel view and take in the full richness. The other one, of course, that people relate to us and then give us what we want. So I had that in my fieldwork in Senegal all the time. I started in the traditional, language description paradigm, working on one language that is also associated with one village because of the male founders. It's the language of the male founders, but the inhabitants are, of course, very multilingual. And so people knew that I was interested in that language. And so when then I started to become interested in multilingualism, people, I had already people who were censoring themselves and giving me what they thought I wanted. And we wanted to make a film on multilingualism, which we actually managed to do, but there was somebody who had appointed himself as kind of the language curator, who we wanted to film, spontaneous interaction to bring out the multilingual richness. And he went before us and said, hey, they're coming with the camera. You only speak Baino Kujaha now. And so it took a long time to undo this perspective, which we had brought on ourselves. So I think that is very beautiful. But also this, what we now seen, we have seen it with Christian, we have seen it with Jill, that places can be associated with the language, but that does not reflect the full range of their inhabitants. That is the outcome of a particular ideological process, how a language becomes associated with a place. So we have already, covered rich ground, and I wonder what we will discover now when we move to the Philippines. And I give the floor to Christina.
So I work in an island called Babuyan Claro, which is a small island community located in the far north of the Philippines with a population of about 3,000. And to get to the island, you have to ride a small fishing boat, which only sails on good weather conditions. So in the summer of 2018, during my first field trip to the island, I had to stay for several days on the mainland in a small bunkhouse together with the Ibatans while waiting for the boat that would take us to Babuyan Claro. And during that waiting time, I saw the interaction of these two little boys of about 5 or 6 years old who were also staying in the bunkhouse. And they spoke very different languages, but they didn't seem to have any problem with it. And they were clearly having fun playing games as kids do. And while this is indeed like a very common scene you see in children of that age, that is that they don't seem to mind that they are using two different languages to each other. It is also what can be observed in Babuyan Claro generally. So the main residential settlement on Babuyan Claro is divided into two geographical regions, which they call Daya or East, and then Laod or West. And as you walk along from east to west, you would notice a change in the patterns of language use. So in Daya, you would hear more Ibatan, which is the local language of the community. But as you head west towards Laod, you would notice a shift in the language spoken. Here, you'd hear more Ilocano, or at least a variety of Ilocano mixed with Ibatan. Ilocano is the regional lingua franca of the Babuyan group of islands in northern Luzon. And because Babuyan Claro is such a small community, the people know each other's genealogies, language histories, and linguistic repertoires, like what we've seen from the other speakers. And so if someone from Daya talks to someone from Laod, they would both know that they both understand Ibatan. And so the person from Daya would talk in Ibatan, but the person from Laod would typically choose to respond in Ilocano. But if the speaker talks to a new immigrant, this is usually an Ilocano who comes to the island for work, they would know to use Ilocano to that person because they know that that person doesn't understand Ibatan. And as for me, since during my first field trip, I spoke very little Ibatan nor Ilocano, they know that they would resort to using Filipino to me because they know that it's the language I am most comfortable with. And like what you've mentioned, Frederique, I think this is like a very unique feature for small-scale communities, this awareness of people's linguistic repertoires. And you can't see this in big cities such as Metro Manila, where people would just resort to using the lingua franca, Filipino in this case, because that's just the default for everyday communication.
Thank you, Christina. This is very interesting, and it's also a good reminder that, for multilingualism studies, we really need to look at rural small-scale communities because the bulk of research is actually focused on urban or urbanizing settings, very often also in context of migration. And we see very different patterns there. So the picture of multilingualism that is informing research is a very incomplete one and actually not characteristic of what is happening in the majority of, the world's population. Thank you.
Yeah, so the next question that we're going to discuss is about what's special about the different settings where we work. And I think, like Frederica was saying, a lot of what goes on in these small-scale communities isn't really very well documented. And where I do my research in Western Arnhem Land, not far from where Jill works at Wateree Community, one of the things I found was particularly common is receptive multilingualism, which Jill's already mentioned. And I think also Christina was talking about how people speak to one another in different languages. And it's seems to be quite common in quite a lot of contexts of small-scale multilingualism. There hasn't been that much research on receptive multilingualism, but what there is in large cities looking at language shift. So where migrants to a country are shifting towards the dominant language. And so, for example, the first generation who've migrated will use their language with their children, but their children might speak back in the dominant language, such as English in Australia. And so their children might just grow up learning to understand their heritage language, but not speak it. So it has been associated with language shift, but in these small scale contexts, it actually seems to be associated with language maintenance. So for example, at Warawi, where I work, the language Maung, which is associated with the place, is very small, only has a few hundred speakers, and there's other languages spoken in the community which have a few thousand speakers, which is relatively large for that area. And so what happens is that Maung speakers tend to speak Maung as much as possible, even to people who don't speak it. But those people will generally understand Maung if they've been in the community for a while. And so this receptive multilingual practice enables Maung speakers to continue to use Maung and not be forced to accommodate to larger languages and ultimately shift to those languages. So I'm going to pass the ball to Jill to talk a little bit more about what happens in Maningrida. And then Alex is going to make some comments as well.
Thanks, Ruth. And yeah, what I want to talk about picks up really nicely on the idea of receptive multilingualism, and you mentioned the word accommodation. That's what I'd like to talk about, I think. So the most striking difference for me between the setting where I work and what I'm kind of used to growing up, say in Melbourne or other parts of the world that are largely a monolingual experience for many of us, is the fact that when we belong to and are socialized in a monolingual culture, we take all these sorts of things for granted about how interaction works and the kinds of pressures that we respond to when we're communicating. And one of these core assumptions that's actually also widely assumed even in the sociolinguistic literature is this notion of accommodation as some kind of universal across communicative settings. So accommodation refers to the idea that we somehow adjust our speech or our signing or our communicative practices to be more attuned to our interlocutor in some way. And this might mean adjusting your accent somehow, or your vocabulary, or in fact the entire language that you choose to use in a communication. And it's grounded in the idea that there's a sort of a psychological predisposition to prefer that which is more similar to ourselves in some way. However, when we look at the great diversity of multilingual practices around the world, and in particular at contexts of small scale and egalitarian multilingualism, we actually see quite different pressures at work. And I've certainly been struck by this in a lot of interactions that I've observed. So in Arnhem Land, for example, and across many parts of Indigenous Australia, difference between people or difference between groups is not always seen as something that necessarily marks a boundary between social and cultural groups. Instead, differences, and I'm including linguistic differences here, are in a lot of ways internal to society, and they're not markers of the edges of different ones. It's being highlighted. So to quote a well-known Maung songman, James Woolamuru, he says, "We're all different together." So you have this idea of difference being a uniting thing. And to quote someone else, the anthropologist Peter Sutton, he notes that in this context, differences actually make for social complementarity in some way. And so there's value placed on the equality of all the local traditional languages in Maningrida, for example. So they're not placed within a social hierarchy. And this is one of the key defining features of small-scale multilingual contexts. And because of all the sort of various multilingual strategies that are in operation, this diversity, this linguistic diversity, does not, as we've heard, have to be an impediment to communication, as it's often assumed elsewhere. And so some actual examples of how I've seen this play out in terms of linguistic outcomes in Arnhem Land. So receptive multilingualism, certainly, where people are sticking to their own language and sort of resisting accommodation to the other interlocutor. But also the fact that in Maningrida, so for a long time now, there have been many different languages that have been spoken side by side in a fairly sort of increasingly urbanized environment. But in fact, in this context, no communalect has ever arisen as a lingua franca between all these diverse groups in Maningrida. So that is to say that no one language gets used between speakers of different languages. Instead, as we've heard, a whole highly multilingual repertoires. And a third outcome is what you might call deliberate differentiation, or Ausbau, to borrow a term, where even at the level of very small groups like clans, for example, you get the emergence of a kind of sort of shibboleth, for example. So small subsets of the language, such as, say, an interjection or even a prefix or something like that, distinguishes one clan's language from the next clan along. And so linguist Murray Gard has described this for the Biningunwok speaking clans in his work on Gundangwok systems, where you get particular clanlets that are distinguished by small subsystems of the language. So you get this quite subtle but highly significant difference in the pressures acting on communication, but which actually has quite dramatic linguistic outcomes. And of course, these are absolutely not unique to small-scale multilingual communities, but they do contravene some key ideologies that regulate monolingual settings that we're perhaps more familiar with.
Thanks, Jill. I think Alex had some comments to say about that question as well.
Yep. No, I was just going to make the small comment that, you know, we come, I as a linguist and you know, most of us, we come from societies, European or Western societies, where monolingualism is the norm, right? And this norm in our countries is enforced in so many ways. We think of school, education, but also mass media, signing in the street and so on, and lots of things which, lots of ways in which monolingualism is taken for granted actually by everybody in popular culture also. So now in our societies, Western societies, it's not to say that each country has only one language. First, there's of course the traditional minority or regional languages. You know, my grandmother was Basque and so on. So I see, I know what it is. That minority languages are, which are indigenous to our Western countries, are not recognized sufficiently, and let alone, you know, minority languages in the colonies, in the former colonies of like, you know, New Caledonia or lots of other places in you know, in the French realm, because I'm from France, and of course you would have similar parallel stories with other Western countries. In many ways, so our Western countries are faced with multilingualism, but it's usually in the conversation, whether it's political conversation or you know, social conversation, it's always framed. It tends to be framed as a problem or as something. You know, multilingualism in our Western society is going to be either a problem that needs to be solved, or sometimes it's a relic of the past, if you want. So it's you're going to have, you still have some Basque speakers, still have some speakers of Corsican, but it's sort of seen as a relic of the past. Or if you think of migrant languages, you know, the languages of migrant people who come from Africa, from Northern Africa, from Syria, and so on. Well, they have, it's something seen as maybe due to their current circumstances that this generation is still speaking their original languages, but they haven't, you know, if things go well, they will all be monolingual in French by one generation. That's sort of frame of mind. That's known as the monolingual mindset, right? Okay, and then when I went to Vanuatu, it struck me how multilingualism is actually the norm. I mean, it's true that some villages will tend to speak one language, but as I described, you would always hear other languages, and it's sort of taken for granted, and you don't necessarily have the notion that one language has more prestige than others, or that people are supposed to quickly run towards monolingualism. But it's, you know, it's really part of the expectations that each individual would know several languages, and that people who come to the island or to the village will usually come with their own language and still speak it. So I wanted to highlight this contrast, that it's not just because the language size is smaller that you hear more language. It's really a different mindset, if you want, different expectations and so on. So that's I think what we want to document as linguists partly is the languages themselves, right? We write a dictionary of one of the languages and a grammar, and that's fine. We need to do that. But also we want to document the language ecology of each area, which is different from the one we know in our countries.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you also for bringing this false paradox to our attention, which is of course related to monolingual ways of seeing multilingualism. As you have said, the applied linguist Jim Cummins has called it the solitude approach to multilingualism. We see multilingualism as stacked on monolingualisms. During last year's first ever small-scale multilingualism conference in Lyon, Nick Evans captured this attitude very nicely, because he said, you know, I'm a multilingual, but if I am in a global north context, I'm always supposed to be a monolingual in my monolingualism. I always have to go all the way. So if I learn Dutch, I have to speak Dutch in all contexts. That's also a very contradictory message to multilinguals, because so the burden is on them to be several monolinguals in one, not to be multilinguals, that is, use their resources in adaptive ways tailored to their social life. And that brings me to the next question that we're going to look at together, language ideas. And I hope it will be possible to show that the European language ideas that have become so dominant in the wake of European expansion are not the only ones, and that they are not really suited to approach the ecologies we are talking about. So you, for instance, Alex, you mentioned that, you know, speakers say, I can tell you that story in one of 4 languages, you pick. And that, of course, defies the deeply ingrained notion that speakers from the global north have on a native language, right? Or an L1. So the one language that expresses all of your identity, and that ideally you would use in all circumstances of life, that you would also read and write, which is not the case in the ecologies that we are looking at all, where people use languages in different modalities, speaking, signing, writing, reading, but not one language in all of them. And so I invite all of you now to talk about language ideas, and I give the floor first to Christina.
So in my case, the people of Babuyan Claro are exposed to at least 2 languages. So Ibatan, which is a smaller language, and Ilocano, the regional lingua franca. And language use is deeply connected with how one views their own ethnicity. And this is actually very much fluid and dynamic for the people of Babuyan Claro. You can actually particularly see this fluidity among the Ilocano immigrants on Babuyan Claro. So when asked if they see themselves as Ilocano or Ibatan or mixed, especially if they are already married into the community, they would respond in percentages. And this depends on how much they know and use Ibatan. So for example, one would say they see themselves as 80% Ilocano and 20% Ibatan because they don't really use Ibatan that much yet. While some would say 50-50 because they have come to use Ibatan more often in Babuyan Claro than their mother tongue, Ilocano. So while Babuyan Claro is a small community, there is also still community and individual level variation in terms of language use and the person's awareness of the boundaries between the languages in their linguistic repertoire. So language use and ideologies actually depend on one's personal history, genealogy, and the network of people they interact with. So the Daya people, as I've mentioned earlier, of the East, seem to be very much aware of the distinction between Ivatan and Ilocano, and they tend to keep the two languages separate. They tend to see their variety of Ivatan as the pure version of Ivatan. While for the people of Laod, or the West, they don't seem to be too conscious of this distinction and tend to mix the two languages in their speech. When I ask them what they think of this kind of speech behavior, they would just say, that's just how I speak, that's just natural for me. And this speech behavior is actually a distinct marker of Laod. This is known as Ibacano, or like a blend of Ibatan and Ilocano. And so as you can see, this variation in terms of language use and ideologies, which are also tied to one's perception of ethnicity, is so evident in Babuyan Claro, and so clearly highlights the diversity of context that underpins small-scale multilingualism. And so even within a small community such as Babuyan Claro, you can see this variation, which makes, understanding patterns of language use all the more interesting.
Thank you, Christina. You showed us how languages can serve to index identity in very complex ways, and also depend, of course, on linguistic categorization that speakers and signers engage in. And Christian has something beautiful to tell us, I think a beautiful metaphor of how people in his research area conceptualize their language ecology.
Yes, before I do that, I'll try to answer a little bit on the question whether speakers actually do have something like a native language or a mother tongue. And I think at least for Southern New Guinea, I could say yes. So people do have what I said before, it's the patriarch, so it's really the father tongue. It's the language of place that is important for themselves and their identity. And we know this from other places like Northern Australia, we already heard this, that there's a very strong connection between land and clan, or land and language. So this is also the case here. And in my research in the village, I've come across many speakers who, for sort of personal history reasons, have grown up in the neighboring village, yet they belong to a clan of Roku. So they often would almost in an apologetic way tell me, well, I speak most of the time the language of the neighboring village, and when I really should speak the language Komto, which is the language of my place. So place is really important here. At the same time, speakers, of course, do make choices when they choose a language to speak to, so the language that they speak. So as an example, my so to speak adopted father in the village had a friend from the administrative town Morehead next door, and both of them were in an age bracket where their schooling education took place in the 60s, and all schools in the 60s were run not in English but were run in Motu, which is another one of the lingua franca in Papua New Guinea. And those two were basically talking to each other in Motu, which is something I have otherwise never heard, because the language has now been, or Motu has now been supplanted by English. Okay, but as you already mentioned, I think we can learn a lot from certain myths or from ancestral stories about the way how people perceive multilingualism, or how people think about languages. So in this sort of sub-region of Southern New Guinea that's called the Morehead district, there's a common myth found in various places where you have a sort of an apical ancestor, the first person of your particular group, who hears voices coming from a tree, and he doesn't know what's going on, so he decides to chop down the tree a little bit to see what's going on there. And he starts with the top of the tree, and then there are people emerging out of the tree, and they speak a language which he cannot understand. And those people run off, they go to another place. And then he chops a little more, and the next group of people comes out, and he can maybe make out a word or two, but he doesn't know the language otherwise. And these people run off again. So he works his way down, and down the tree by chopping off even more. And it's only at the very base of the tree and that his people emerge and they speak his language and they settle with him at that particular place. So this myth you can find in different villages, and obviously the languages at the base are different languages depending on where you're being told that story. So in everyday speech, on everyday conversations about multilingualism, speakers of Konzo often use this tree metaphor. So they talk about the different languages in the area as a tree, and they would often say, Konzo, our language is the stem of the tree, and the other languages are the branches and twigs and so on. And if you go to the next village next door, which would be Yokwa, and the language of Yokwa is called Wera, then people would tell you the same story, but of course they would place Wera at the base of that tree. So what I found interesting here is that although people are aware that some languages are more similar than others, yeah, maybe I should mention that Roku sits on the border of the subgroups within the language family. So on the eastern side of Roku is a village called Karaita, with a language called Nama, and Nama is a different subgroup. So if you compare it with English, you would say it's maybe like English and French. If you go the other direction to the west, as I mentioned, there's a village called Yokwa with a language called Wera, and that language is more maybe like English and Dutch. So it's rather more similar. And although speakers are aware of these differences, basically all the different varieties, whether you would regard them as a dialect chain or whether you would regard them as a different language, they are all perceived as different languages. So that's plays its own variety or own language, whatever you choose. Okay, I'll pass back to you, Philippe.
Thank you, Christian. I'm wondering, Alex, if I'm not mistaken, you have described identities in Vanuatu very often as multiple linguistic identities. So I wonder how you have experienced people conceptualizing languages or, actually reifying languages.
Well, thanks. I wish I had such a nice traditional story about the origin of languages as Christian was telling. I've heard and recorded origin stories of, this island, how it came out of the sea, or this volcano, or how the lake came to be. But oddly enough, although people are aware of the multiplicity of the diversity of languages that surround them, I've never heard traditional stories of or metaphors or allegories like this one. But one thing for sure is you can see how, when you interact with people, you see how much languages in Vanuatu and language diversity are strongly related to place. Each language is related to a place. One simple observation is that each language name is also the name of a place. The place usually being a language, a village. It can be a village, but it can be the name of the an area larger than the village, if you want, or the bay or the cape. But you will have this pattern where a language is connected to a place, and then rather than being connected to the people or families or clans. So you don't have this idea in Vanuatu of I belong to this clan or this lineage, therefore I speak this language. It's more I am tied to this place. So I was born here, so I speak the language of here, but I spent 5 years in the next island, so of course I'm bilingual. And then I married a woman from the other village over there, so I speak her language. So as I moved around, as each individual moves around the archipelago, they are supposed to pick up languages, and traditionally they do, and so I like this idea of that each language, each person enriches their own identity as they move along the world, right? Sometimes it's, even modern life can have children go to school to another island. So people from Hiu, they go to school in in the area of Toga, in the Torres Islands in northern Vanuatu, because that's where the school is. But they're supposed to be picking up French or English, most English in the school. But and they do learn English, but the first thing they will pick up is the language of the island, which is southern, Torres, where the school is, and it's kind of obvious to them. So in a way, when people get to their, I don't know, 40s or 50s, they will have, traveled around the world and enriched their backpack, if you want, and their life with the language of all the places they've been to. I like this idea.
Wonderful, Alex. Thank you. I wonder what Jill has to tell us, because I know that in Australia, the relationship between language and land, but also this distinction between having a particular relationship to the land, so owning a language, which is not necessarily the language that you speak most in your mobile daily life, is also very pertinent. So Jill.
Thanks. So to continue the theme from Christian of sort of stories and metaphors about language that give us some interesting insights into the question, I might give some examples from a little activity that we did in Maningrida a couple of years ago. So a few folks that I work with from different language groups from the language teaching team at the school had actually watched a documentary that Ruth Singer had been part of, where she had used this activity of language portraits, which some of you might be familiar with. So a task where you're asked to complete a language drawing, which represents in some way your linguistic repertoire visually. Usually by the sort of classic task is by colouring in and annotating a black outline of a body. So you colour in different body parts and annotate them and so on. And so they'd seen Ruth do this with Maung and Gunwingu speakers at Warawee and thought that this was awesome and wanted to give it a go. And so I thought, yep, great, no worries, we'll do that. And it actually turned out to be really fascinating. It wasn't a planned thing particularly, and it was a great insight into the metaphors and ideologies that shape how language is thought about and reified. So the first interesting thing I found was that actually most people didn't want to use the body outlines. They were quite resistant to this sort of provided metaphor that were part of the original activity, and they all opted to draw their own images or to create them in some way. So I'll give a few examples. So Laurie, who is a senior Barada woman, and she was the one who instigated the activity and who really took to it. She drew an image of her own face with 12 sort of speech bubbles or clouds coming out of her mouth, and each one was annotated with a different language. And she came up with a color code for each of those little bubbles according to her use of and her relationship with the language. So she had a key at the side so we could interpret it. And so 7 of the 12 languages were fully or partially colored green to show that these were languages that she spoke every day. And the rest were colored orange or gray or some combination of the two to show that she either understood and could speak just a little bit of that language, or that she could understand them but couldn't speak them at all. And so this highlights a few things, but one of them is this local ideological importance of speaking versus hearing a language. So you might be connected to a language and understand it, but not actually have competence in speaking it. And that's a very important thing that emerges from a lot of discussions. So a second portrait from also a Barada woman, but a younger Barada woman, Abby. Abby drew 2 different portraits. So the first was a tree, again, labeled with all the languages that she spoke and connected to. And like in Christian's example, her main language was at the base of the trunk as the most kind of fundamental one. And that's her father's language, Barada. And her mother's language was next along the trunk. And then 4 more local languages, traditional languages, were further up and in the branches to show their lesser importance. And she chose not to include English, which she speaks fluently and daily, and she chose not to include Creole, which she has some command over, as they're not seen as part of her own linguistic identity. And so Abby's portrait, I think, highlights the fact that certain languages are ideologically prescribed, if you will, particularly the father's language, as we've heard, the patrilect, and some are not. So, for example, English. In her second portrait, which is quite different, she drew a branch of red eucalyptus blossoms, which appear in the dry season. And these are known in Barada as Martai flowers. And Martai is also a group label for the particular Barada-speaking clans for whom these flowers are an important cultural emblem. And it's also a group that she belongs to, and it's used as a label for their particular dialect. And so this is another nice way of highlighting the connection between clan, between territory, and between language. A third participant, so Jinang man, Stanley, he chose to illustrate his connections to languages with an illustration of a narrative, a Dreamtime story that's associated with the Jinang people. And it had different characters illustrated in it, with speech bubbles, each speaking their own language, traveling along and speaking those languages in relevant places. So again, highlighting this connection back to the creation stories and where these connections to land originate from for many people. And in the last portrait from a Guningu man called Alastair, Alastair was happy to use a body outline for his portrait, but he did his own one because he didn't like the one we'd provided. So he drew his own, and he annotated parts of the body with different languages, but connected each annotation with members of his family. So his father's language, for example, and his mother's language. And what was really interesting is that for many of these annotations, the kin category aligned with the sign in local sign language for that kin relationship. So for example, you can gesture to your shoulder to refer to your father, and that's where he put his father's language. You can gesture to your forehead for your mother's mother, and that's where he put his mother's language on his body. So a really embodied understanding of connection to language, and also highlighting the very important related idea of the connections between language and kin, that you connect through two different languages through different kin relations, and that you have quite different rights and responsibilities depending on what that connection is to the land, to the language, and to other kinds of cultural inheritances. So a whole host of ways of thinking about language, and also a plug for language portraits as a sort of unexpectedly nice methodology for tapping into them.
Thanks, Jill. That was a really interesting discussion of how people make different metaphors, I guess, to talk about their languages. And I think even though a lot of communities do have myths about how their languages came into being, there's also the question of how the language continues to be now, which for all these communities is very difficult. And particularly, for example, in Arnhem Land, you know, there's an expectation that people use English for lots of different things. And I think often when people do language portraits and don't include English, which I've also noticed that people often don't, they're making a statement about the importance of their Indigenous languages and how that it sort of exists in a whole nother sphere and has a whole nother value to English. So I thought it might be interesting to talk about the motivations that people have to remain multilingual and how they resist the pressure to abandon small-scale multilingualism and become monolingual. And I was wondering, Christina, if you wanted to comment on that at all from your perspective.
Yeah, so to begin, I honestly found it quite challenging to give a vignette earlier of an everyday interaction in Babuyan Claro, because it doesn't tell the full story of the Ibatans, as it just provides a snapshot of the community at a particular point in time. And I've always seen the story of Babuyan Claro as the sum of social, political, cultural, and linguistic changes that happened over the past 150 years of the community. So let me answer the question by telling briefly the story of Babuyan Claro. So it's a relatively small community and very young, where the first families either come from the Batanic-speaking islands further north of Babuyan Claro, or the Ilocano-speaking families of the neighboring Babuyan Islands. And these families were shipwrecked on the island of Babuyan Claro. So the type of social interaction that existed across the two groups during these early years of the community fostered this egalitarian multilingualism, where the people are proficient to a certain degree in both Ibatan and Ilocano, and where Ibatan and Ilocano existed in a more or less equal footing. But around the 1970s or so, Ilocano rose to prominence in Babuyan Claro, because the island or the community has become more integrated within the larger town of Calayan, which is where Ilocano is mainly spoken, and it is also the regional lingua franca. So the Ibatans had to do their schooling in Calayan during this time. And it was also around this larger region of the Babuyan group of islands where the Ibatans experienced cases of bullying or harassment because of their ethnicity. And so this has led to the endangerment of Ibatan during this time. And so speakers were shifting to Ilocano because they see it as a language of opportunity or the language with more social value, especially when they travel outside Babuyan Claro. However, starting around the 1980s, with the help of Rundle and Judy Marie of the Summer Institute of Linguistics, we can see the empowerment of the Ibatans. They've established a school on the island where the Ibatans don't have to go outside the community to do their schooling. The production of literacy materials in the Ibatan language, and the most pivotal of which is the granting of the Certificate of Ancestral Domain title to the Ibatans, which grants the Ibatan people collective rights to their land and their surrounding seas. So this has led to the empowerment of the Ibatan community and consequently the renewed vitality of Ibatan. However, as you have seen in this brief description, the Babuyan Claro has an extremely fragile sociolinguistic setting, and this is clearly shaped by the changing socio-political landscape of the community. And while Ibatan is still being passed on to the younger generation, it is still considered a threatened language. So because Ilocano is still considered the language of higher social value, and the political tension between the Ibatans and the larger region outside it still exists, Babuyan Claro is also becoming more and more integrated within the larger nation state of the Philippines, which means more exposure to Filipino, the national language of the country. And in the Philippines, we also have this like neoliberal policies that favor the use of particular languages. And this is a threat to the languages of these small-scale communities. We have, I think many of you are familiar with this kind of policy, the English-only policy, where a student has to pay for every word in their mother tongue that they speak. So now when talking about the social linguistic context that underpins the small-scale multilingual communities, it is extremely fragile and can change drastically within a generation. And this is clearly reflected in the history of Babuyan Claro. So talking about language endangerment means that we also have to acknowledge the endangerment of the language ecology of these small-scale communities. And it is actually this language ecology that gets endangered first before the endangerment of the languages.
Thank you, Christina. I think we all have observed similar factors. So first of all, the influx of languages that come with social capital and with diglossia, so higher social prestige, which disrupt these egalitarian language ecologies based on conviviality and relationality, but also the integration into larger scales that really threaten these ecologies. Now, all these observations, of course, beg important questions for linguists working on these settings and their roles in supporting these language ecologies, which is something that is not really part and parcel of, the core mission as it is defined by our discipline, so to speak, still, which is always starting from providing a description of a particular language or documenting a particular language, although there are now beginning efforts to actually extend the gaze and look at language ecologies. But what is the role of linguists in working with communities whose language ecologies are very fragile and threatened, including actually by the prevailing linguistic views that we bring in to these communities and the prestige that we bring with the big languages that we speak? So this is a question that we would like everybody to look at. And I think on our list, let me see, I think Christian is the first to address it.
Okay, I think the obviously different strategies or different approaches work in different places. And the whole idea of raising the prestige of the particular languages that we work on is of course also important, but it sort of aims at a different angle and doesn't really capture the idea of preserving the ecology. It's also what just Christina was mentioning, that I wholly agree with this, that it's mostly the language ecology that is even much more endangered than the individual languages that exist within that ecology. But maybe just, yeah, I would say as linguists, we should take this, these ecologies for something real. And I'm very much guilty of this myself. So when I started to work in Roku as a PhD student, my task was to write a grammatical description of Komso. And although I had been educated in a way to look at sort of a holistic approach to language, I was looking at a particular phenomenon to work on for my PhD, but really I was trying to capture the whole language, so to say. But when I started to work there, of course, I quickly noticed that a lot of people did not talk Komso, they talked a different language. And at the very beginning, I saw this, of course, as a huge distraction to my work. And I did a little sociolinguistic questionnaire to do an inventory of people's language portfolios to see who speaks what, basically. And I can very much relate to what Alex was saying at the beginning, that people are, of course, aware. Once you introduce yourself as the linguist who works on Komso, then people are very much aware and they will perceive you as the guy who works on Komso and not on these other languages. So very often I had people come to me and tell me things like, don't work with this family or don't work with that individual because they really only speak what people call mother's language. Yeah? So they, in the area, mother's language means the language from the neighboring village. So they told me, gave me advice like this: don't work with them. They only speak mother's language. We want you to work on Komso and so on. So my focus was really on documenting and describing Komso, and in the beginning at least, I neglected or pushed aside this whole multilingual language ecology, which I now see as a fascinating field of study, and would like to remedy in the future to look more at actual language use. That's what I would have to add. So we should take it for something real. That's already a very big step for linguistics as a field.
Thank you, Christian. Yes, I completely share your feelings. And from my personal perspective and experience, I think it's not possible to do this as an individual researcher. So you need a team of researchers, and crucially, in my experience, community members become much, much more important because they are the multilingual speakers. So the linguist's role as an expert is much reduced in my experience as soon as you really want to deal with the full complexity of multilingual language use in small languages, of which I perhaps, have a little competence in 1 or 2, but there's in 7 or 8. I think Christina is next to talk to us about the roles of linguists.
Yeah, but for me, I'd like to approach this question from the perspective of research and academia more generally, and not just our role as linguists. As a Filipino linguist and academic working with minority communities here in the Philippines, I am taking a rather strong stand on the researcher's role when they do fieldwork in these communities. So, for example, when talking about language endangerment, this issue needs to be set within the larger framework of social justice. And the points I raise here is largely based also on the work of my colleague, Jesus Federico Hernandez at the Department of Linguistics here at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. So here in the Philippines, there are so much social problems these communities are facing. So community leaders are still being arrested, disappeared, or killed because of political tensions between the communities and the government. Mining corporations are displacing indigenous communities, and there is an overall lack of institutional support for these communities from both the local and the national government. So these extra linguistic factors are actually what drive minority communities further into the periphery, thus leading to language endangerment. And as researchers, we are accountable to these communities, but sadly, decades of colonial practices in the academia have also contributed to the trauma, abuse, and fatigue these communities have faced. And some of these communities actually feel resentful towards academics because they feel that their knowledge and identity are taken or stolen from them, and that oftentimes they are left with nothing. And up to now, the academic community has done very little to address the trauma they inflicted to these communities. And so as researchers on the ground, we see these injustices happening firsthand. So we have to take a more active approach as advocates for these communities. We actually have the platform to amplify the voices of the minority communities. For example, we are in the position to draft policy recommendations that demand stronger state support for them. So for me, it is unethical to maintain neutrality when you see these injustices happening. And we also have to demand that academia moves away from these harmful colonial practices and also, demand apology for the trauma these communities have experienced from us as researchers.
Thank you, Christina, for this very powerful statement that I think is something that we all need to hear and act on. And Alex, what is your reaction to this and to the role of linguists when working with minoritized communities?
Exactly. So, yeah, I agree. It's important, of course, for the linguists who for us who are experiencing, this new way of looking at languages and language diversity. That we are discovering it as individuals. As I said, I was fascinated in Vanuatu by the egalitarian multilingualism and how it shaped people's lives. But also, I wrote a paper and a few things in order to actually share that observation. For a while before that, I thought, okay, it's just part of the fieldwork experience. But as far as academic publications are going to be concerned, I'm going to just publish, dictionaries and grammars of individual languages, which is what I'm supposed to be doing. And then one day I thought, but actually that whole entanglement of languages and the way it shapes society or social networks and stuff is actually fascinating per se. So it's not, so my work as a linguist is not just about documenting each language, which is fine and necessary, but also to actually take a step back, if you want, and have a social linguist's point of view, and looking also at what all those languages being intertwined and being different from each other in such a small space, if you want, small social network, what it tells us about not just the languages themselves, the phonology, morphology, but what it tells us about the people who speak them, the society, how they're actually building a community or several, not just linguistic facts, but also facts about society, about how we build a community, a nation, I could say, because I've been coming, as I said before, from this framework where, and also which is typical of the Western societies, the monolingual mindset, but also as we know, in the 1960s, 1970s, the push for independence of African countries and Asian countries and so on was quite often framed as a matter let's unite the nation of Cameroon, or or this. Let's forget about our regional peculiarities, and if we want to be united, let's choose one language. Or I mean, in some languages, in some countries, you have this. You had, or you still have, this focus on unity means social unity, means monolingualism. We have to get rid of the past diversity, if you want, or which was probably not labeled as diversity, but disintegration of the nation, unity into small minorities. Now, living in Vanuatu, I was fascinated to see how multilingualism is not just, as we said, a relic of the past, or something problematic, that or something which was just a sort of a mechanical effect of physical isolation, as is usually being framed as, oh, they have volcanic islands and it's probably hard to go from one village to the other, so they ended up being multilingual. But that's not the way it works. People move around all the time, they intermarry all the time. If they wanted to become monolingual, they could. I mean, if there were the same social pushers, social drives as we're used to, in Western societies, then this would have happened for a long time. That people would have created, larger languages. But so it was the first time I was witnessing firsthand the actual push for diversity. You see what I mean? It was obvious that if people wanted to have just one language for Vanuatu or for Northern Vanuatu, they could have. And instead, what I could witness by observing the languages themselves, but also the attitudes of people, is how people value diversity. And I think this can be also a take-home message for our societies, that monolingualism is not a fatality, is not necessarily the only way to look at things. Monolingualism is curable. You can it's okay to be monolingual. Nobody's perfect, but you can. There are remedies against monolingualism, and that's we can be bilingual, and our children can learn many languages, and our societies also, not just individual children learning languages at school, but our societies could do with more, signing in several languages, or multimedia. Mass media being in favoring, promoting language diversity. And what I saw on small scale in Vanuatu, I thought was worth sharing with other linguists, and also with with the broader audience, to highlight how it is possible to build multilingual societies that favor, that cherish diversity.
Thank you, Alex. So I hear that actually we need a kind of linguistics that cares more about the speakers, hearers, listeners, signers, readers, writers of languages, and a kind of linguistics that actively works towards enabling them to maintain the diversity that they wish to maintain, rather than seeing it as an obstacle, something that needs to be diminished, regulated, reduced, standardized. And I wonder what Jill has to say about the role of linguists in this, and what they can practically do to contribute to this goal.
So just a short point, really, as I very much add my support to everything that's been said already, and certainly the importance of documenting language ecologies rather than sort of artificially isolating individual languages from their context. And that goes hand in hand with really centering the lived experiences of speakers and signers and so on, and their communities, which we're still quite bad at as a field, I think. But a sort of a crucial and quite a concrete contribution that I think for linguists is, where possible, to support vernacular literacy and materials which support the language ecology as a whole. So a good way to do this, if it's feasible, is to get involved with and to offer expertise to local schools and to other local institutions which have some kind of stake in language work, which in a very multilingual community is many of them, and if not all of them. And so this might be, for example, in my experience, local art centres or museums or local Indigenous ranger groups even. And work in these settings interacts in so many ways, really, with the outcomes of language documentation and linguistic research. But they're often also susceptible very much to the pressures to produce materials in English, or quite commonly to pick a single local language due to the genuine challenges of working across different languages where literacy may not be high, for example. And so this is really work that a linguist can help with, and that can have tangible and useful outcomes that really work alongside community goals, but may also be recognisable in an academic setting, perhaps.
Thank you, Jill. This is actually something that we've been trying in an association in Senegal that has come out of the Crossroads project, where we have developed a multilingual literacy program that is really based on repertoires. So you take the official alphabet of Senegal, and the classroom determines how multilingual the learning experience is. And this is something we've been experimenting with and are building on. And it also a very humbling experience for us Western participants, because really the local teachers and participants are the experts, you know, so they get to reclaim ownership of their repertoires. So thank you for answering this question. We had another question planned, but I think we skip it because many important points were already discussed. And we have a very engaged audience, many friends and colleagues who have sent us greetings. And we have a number of really relevant questions that we'd like to address. Ruth, would you like to kick off the Q&A session?
Happy to. We got a question early on from Alice Chick. I'll just read it out. She said, this point about receptive multilingualism is very interesting, but does it depend highly on what you mentioned about the length of time being in the community? I guess my question is, does receptive multilingualism depend on stability of the community? So I'd like to throw this question over to Christian to comment on.
I think this, so the way this was phrased meant that it was sort of picking up on what you, Ruth, mentioned before about the Northern Australian case and how much people are proficient in certain languages. As for Southern New Guinea, I would say that stability, of course, does play a role, but more stability of a social network. So if people know each other, they would know each other's language repertoire or portfolio, or what's their patrilect, and then they could look at this and see, do I understand the language of the person that I'm talking to, and then we could stay within the same language. Or is it more the case where I said before, where this teacher from the other village, or this well, you could say he was an outsider in that case. He didn't grow up in the region. But he was a teacher in a neighboring village, and the two speakers did not practice what we call now here receptive multilingualism. So they did not stay within their own languages, but they did accommodate towards Hiri Motu in this case, because they had known each other for a very long time. They knew each other's language portfolios, so they knew that more or less the language that they would share, that they would use, is Hiri Motu, and is not their respective patrilects or languages. So I think stability does play a role in the sense of social network stability, but probably not in the sense of whether the community as a whole is stable or whether it's undergoing some sort of drastic or dramatic change.
Thanks. Yeah, I think people often have the idea that people in small communities in remote areas are sort of sitting down in one spot and they don't move. And Wateree community where I work, people are very mobile. Traditionally, of course, all Indigenous Australians were nomadic. And in some sense, they still are. Even though they're living in settlements most of the time, they're moving between them frequently. And I guess what's stable is the social network. But whether they pick up Maung when they're at Waterwee or when they're staying with family who live somewhere else who speak Maung, or, you know, when they're a child, or you know, when they have grandchildren who, you know, grow up speaking Maung, it just, it happens in different ways like that.
Just a short follow-up from me. It's also interesting that in large parts of West Africa I'm familiar with, people have really elaborate greeting sequences that are designed to tease out the most social information as possible. So for instance, first the greeting formula, you know, really differentiate languages to really local lects. So they give you an immediate understanding of where your interlocutor comes from, but then incorporate it into the questions, you know, of a greeting routine when people who don't know each other meet. It's like, okay, what's your name? Who's your father? Who's your mother? Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? So that then you have a good understanding of each other's social networks. And with extended family, the likelihood that you have some shared nodes in your networks are really big. And it also means that you already get a good understanding of the possible overlaps in linguistic repertoire, and can then tailor your communication to that. I see nobody has an immediate reaction to the question about receptive multilingualism. So I think the next question that we had was by my Edinburgh friend and colleague, Thomas Buck. Hi, Thomas, really lovely that you're with us. And so his question is there any change in language use with age? Do people still move many languages when they get old, or do they move to use a smaller repertoire or mixed language? So do they use their full repertoire that they have acquired throughout their lifespan, or is there a reduction when they age? I have to think.
I could make a comment about that. So my sense is, I mean, there's a few different factors going on in the Maningrida context, given that your older speakers tend to have different knowledge of traditional languages and have different languages as part of their repertoire from younger speakers. So that's one factor. But certainly traditionally, and this is picking up on something I think Alex said, older speakers who have traveled a lot and who have met lots of different people build social capital and cultural capital by continuing to acquire languages throughout the lifespan. And particularly senior men are known to be highly multilingual, and in very performative contexts such as ceremony or during dance and song performances, those languages come out and are seen as this incredible rich thing in their backpack, as you said, Alex, you know. So I think it's seen as certainly something that is acquired continually over the lifespan, and something that is then performed as a really rich skill and admired.
I can confirm that from my impression. Also, old people remain mobile. So for instance, widowed women often move back to the family of their sons, if they have sons, and then they're in a completely different linguistic environment and, you know, have various possibilities for integrating. And people visit each other for extended periods of time throughout the year. So this theme of mobility and interconnectedness really emerges, crossing, you know, oceans in this case. So far removed from this idea, you know, of isolated monolingual people sitting behind a mountain or on an island.
I had a comment on the mixing and the question. Thomas Bach was asking whether older speakers mix, so maybe that's something that's worthy to report from Southern New Guinea, that mixing is really something that people look down on. It's really, they have a very purist mindset in the sense that those languages should be kept apart. So if there's any mixing to be observed, it would but what's very frowned upon is if you mix words with a neighboring language, because that's, you know, even if it's just involves, you know, a lexical item where the differences are very tiny, people do pick up on those small things and say, well, he's mixing languages, that's no good. You know, we should speak Konto here, or we should speak Wera next door, but not mix them. So that's something I have observed about mixing. So maybe that's another point we could talk about. It will probably be very different in different areas.
Yeah. Can I add something to Christian's point about mixing? Because I find the historical development of Ivatan as a language and as a community very interesting, because they've come from this mixed ancestry of Batanic and Ilocano speaking families. So actually they acknowledge this mixed ancestry. They know that Ivatan is this mix of Ilocano and Ivatan or Batanic features. And they regard the language of Batanes, the one further north, as the pure version of their language. But at the same time, at present, they have this idea of purity. So they, especially for the people of Daya, they see this the language, their Ivatan language, as pure compared to the more recent language use seen in Laod, which shows more contemporary mixing. And so you see like these layered perceptions of language. So you have this acknowledgement of mixed ancestry, but at the same time, like this ongoing mixing is seen differently.
I could add a small point on the mixing conversation, if that's okay. So I've noticed that code mixing between traditional languages in the Australian context looks very different to code mixing between a traditional language and a colonial arrival. So for example, and this is something that Paddy Epps has noted for the Valpes region of the Amazon, I think, where you get all sorts of mixing between a traditional language and English or perhaps Creole, and the mixing can occur within the level of the clause, so you're getting intrasentential mixing as well as other kinds. Whereas mixing, when it does occur between traditional languages, and it does occur, but it's much more restricted ideologically and grammatically, I guess, even though the languages are actually typologically more similar than a traditional language in, say, English. But you get it in a particular performative context. So those older speakers who have those incredible multilingual skills, it's okay for them to do it in the ceremonial context, but your average multilingual speaker, there are strong ideologies against mixing in day-to-day conversation. You might get a few clauses in one language and then a switch to another, but not necessarily within the clause, except in quite specific circumstances.
Thank you. Should we move on to the next question, which is actually more a comment from Alice Chick, and here it is. The panel brought out a very nice discussion that in an accommodating context, proficiency does not dictate multilingualism. So everyone can be multilingual. And Christina wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment, because when you talk about proficiency, this is connected to the idea of language dominance. And so we've, at least for me, I've been so used to thinking that there is this one dominant language for a person, for a multilingual speaker. And if you tease apart language use, actually, language dominance depends on the context, depends on the situation. So, for example, in particular contexts, a speaker or a person can be dominant in a particular language, whereas in other situations, they can be dominant in a different language. And so, yes, I agree that proficiency is not, is only one factor when you talk about dominance. Exposure and use comes to the picture as well. And just to say that language dominance or proficiency is gradient actually, and can change in a person's lifetime. So I've seen this happening in my context too.
Yes, thank you, Christina, and also thank you, Alice, for this comment. I would also like to follow up briefly because it's a question that we always get in our research. So it's kind of, yeah, but how can you actually measure how, you know, competent people are or how proficient they are? And this is very often done from a monolingual vantage point. So the idea is, you know, if you have a big vocabulary in a language, then you're proficient, and you're less proficient if your vocabulary is smaller. Or there are kind of target, you know, there's target grammatical attainment, etc. But that doesn't make sense from a multilingual's point of view at all, because they do not look their languages in the solitude of monolingualisms, each language in every context. So you can be a highly proficient multilingual when you are multilingual. And that, in my context, means that you go to the shop and you speak Wolof to the shopkeeper, because they're from Dhaka, and you go to an ancestral ceremony, like you pour libations to the ancestors and you speak the ancestral language of the place. And you may not use that language in many other contexts, right? Because then you speak to your co-wife, you know, in the language that you share, and to your foster children in a different language. And that is the competence, but you cannot really measure it. You know, you can only look at it from a kind of social linguistic point of view in terms of communicative competence, right? And this is the competence to look your repertoire in a way that is tailored to your social networks.
Okay, I have something to add from a sort of a group perspective too. So the comment was that, yeah, proficiency doesn't dictate multilingualism. Obviously, in this scenario that I've described in the village Roku, everyone might have a different mix. I mean, in the mix there are maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 different varieties or languages or lects, whatever you call it, of the area, and not everyone would be fluent in all of them. But so proficiency, you know, not obviously proficiency is really important in a one-to-one conversation. Naturally, if people don't accommodate, if they stay within their own languages, then it's really important that they are both proficient in it, of course. But if we look at this from a group perspective, it doesn't really matter. So it's more like the ideology is that it's much more taken for granted that everyone has the right, or naturally does so, and remain with their own patrialect. So I remember that in Roku for a year or two, the pastor of the local church was a guy who spoke Nama. He also spoke Komso, and I said Nama and Komso are as different as, let's say English and French, so fairly different. And the pastor would just naturally deliver his sermon in Nama, and it doesn't really matter, and nobody looked strange at him. Obviously, there were some people who did not speak Nama, who were not proficient in it, but so what, you know, they understood from talking to other people what he was going on about. The same for sort of visitors coming to the village, making announcements. You know, there wouldn't be a special translator who then translates this to Komso or something else. The visitor comes from village X, and then he speaks language X to everyone, and you know, it's just assumed that no translation is necessary and no accommodation is necessary. So from a group perspective, proficiency isn't really that important. I mean, there will be a lot of people who are proficient, so that's enough. Not everyone needs to be proficient. And of course, this is different in a one-to-one conversation, where it's important that everyone is, or the two interactions are indeed proficient. Okay.
Yeah, I could also say to this that in my experience, it is also the expectation, very much in the small-scale ecologies where I work. There are also other settings in West Africa that are less complex, But in the small scale local settings, there is this feeling, yes, we can be multilingual, and that's why we are multilingual. So it is not questioned. And it's not questioned that you can, of course, learn languages just by living and interacting with people. And so that is very often articulated in the language ecologies. So people say, you know, first of all, why would we want to live with people who all speak the same language? We need diversity. So this diversity and unity comes out. That makes us stronger. We need diversity, you know, and then we are really a versatile community that can be resilient, you know. And then the other, one Crossroads project member conducted a social linguistic interview, and then actually, you know, the interviewee started interviewing her on the language situation in the US and said, so, you know, how many languages do you speak, and how many languages are spoken in your town? She said, well, it's very boring. I live in a suburb of Boston and it's really mainly English. And he said, God, c'est nul ça. Well, that's such a boring way of life. And I think that for me is also one of the take-home points from having worked and lived in small-scale multilingual communities. It is not necessary. As Alex said, it is curable. And you don't need highly sophisticated formal language learning, which is actually one of the least successful ways of learning a language. Interestingly, you know, you just need a mindset and a community that allows you to fulfill your linguistic potential.
Can I make a point? You know, I keep comparing Vanuatu with our Western societies because, you know, it's so telltale. You know, when you compare the two mindsets. The question. So one thing I appreciated that Jill said, which was absolutely the right term. It was the fact that in the multilingual societies of the Pacific, Australia in her case, and Vanuatu in my case, it's actually, there's quite some admiration towards, she used the term cultural capital of individuals, and that's the proper, you know, anthropological term. And indeed, people admire, on the one hand, you know, it's kind of taken for granted that people that should be multilingual, but if someone can actually master like 5 languages when giving a speech, or, you know, different languages, that will be admired in a village of Vanuatu. This elderly woman or elderly man, you know, he's been to so many places, he's picked up so many languages, and he can give a speech in Motlap or in Hiu or in, okay. And okay, so if I compare this to our Western societies, I've insisted on the monolingual mindset. But I might add a point, which is it, am I going to say that multilingualism is not valued at all in our societies? And that would be inaccurate, right? Because our Western, modern, educated societies, they do value certain types of multilingualism. So if you're applying for a job and you say, I speak 5 languages, that's going to be admired too, right? And oh, yes, of course, I can list them. You know, I mean, not mine, but you know, you could say I speak English and German and Italian and Russian. You know, and people will actually admire you. So there is also some value given to multilingualism in our Western societies, but it will target certain languages. You know, typically the larger languages with written education. You know, written tradition. And associated with some cultural prestige, if you want. But the same, just to pick an anecdote, when one of my kids was in primary school, I would hear the teacher, you know, in parents' meetings, and in the very same, within 15 minutes, she would say, "Oh, I'm very glad that our children are going to do a bit of German, although they are just, you know, 7 years old and so on. That's not common practice, but I am bilingual in, you know, in French and German, and we're going to favor she would maybe bilingualism, she would say, you know, and so because it's very good for the kids, right? So she would say that for German, and let's learn to count 1 to 10 in the class and so on. And then 10 minutes later on another topic, she complained that a couple of parents, a couple of families in the class, they were still using their migrant languages. One was at home, you know, and the kids, they won't be picking up French or French spelling and so on so well as the others, that they're going to be delayed in their teaching and their education, because at home they don't even speak French at home. You know, this family speaks Arabic, this other family speaks an African dialect, you know, and it was stunning to see the contrast between valuing and promoting and being so proud of, you know, I'm going to introduce a German and teach the kids how to count 1 to 10 in German. But then she was totally dismissing the fact that a child, you know, and she could have, you know, there's so many things you can say in a class, you can do in a classroom with kids from migrant backgrounds. You could have them talk in their languages, or, you know, explain, or how to say, give us a talk on where my parents come from, and how do you count 1 to 10 in Wolof, or, you know, but that never crossed her mind, and won't, you know. So there's also this classist, if you want, like social class aspect to multilingualism. There was this Twitter meme a few months ago, which was, you know, the question was what are the things that are classy if you're rich, but trashy if you're poor, you know? And some people say, you know, hard drugs is going to be dismissed if you're poor, but actually is quite fancy if you're from the elite, and so on, and traveling, or I don't know, lots of things. And some people, you know, they answered, well, speaking many languages, and that's exactly right, you know. So multilingualism is going to be classy if your CV says, I speak Italian and Russian and German, and you know, and that's actually social marker of being well educated. But if you're from a poorer background, and you say in my family we know Arabic and Bambara, that won't count and won't be actually, you know, admired as much as it should, especially with kids, when you want to build their self-confidence and everything. There's so much to do in our societies to, and of course in Australia, for Indigenous languages to actually highlight the beauty or the strength of their multilingual raising, right?
Who wants to follow up on this? I think Christian had also some thoughts on convivial multilingualism.
Yes, maybe a personal anecdote, something I always like to take some thoughts back from working in a place like Papua New Guinea that's very far away from my culture that I was brought up in. I grew up in the eastern part of Germany, very close. We spent lots of vacations or weekend trips to what was then Czechoslovakia or to Poland. Yet I do not remember that any school or any school friend or my own school education offered Czech. You know, there was just no opportunity to learn it, nor was I brought up in an environment where I would be interested in learning it. I mean, I'm interested now that I'm an adult, but this wasn't in the school curricula. So before the German reunification, everyone was taught Russian, of course. And nowadays, everyone is taught English, French, Spanish, and so on. But, you know, it's not part of our school curricula to learn our neighbors' languages, which, you know, in the case where I grew up, it's literally half an hour's drive and you're in the Czech Republic. So why not learn Czech? And this, of course, ties perfectly in with what Alex is saying, because Czech is obviously sort of this highbrow attitude. It's not really something that Germans see as something that's important to learn. And maybe we can learn from the German-French relations how this has changed a lot, because in the western part of Germany, learning French is something that's just taken for granted and more or less for normal. Whereas in the eastern part of Germany, learning your neighbor's language not really done this. And obviously it took a generation or 2 generations to change that picture. So that's something that should be changed in the other parts of Germany too, right? So that's just a little bit of personal story, yeah.
Yes, and why not learn Turkish and Somali?
Yes, of course, yeah. Those would, of course. I mean, your neighbors in a big place like Berlin here are more likely to be speakers of Arabic, of Turkish, Greek, you name it. Maybe not of Czech. So of course, those languages should be added to one's school system as well.
Maybe we wrap it up by discussing this particularly from the angle of a settlement colony and a post-colonial state, Australia and the Philippines, where I think, there is an added political dimension to these issues of inequality.
Yeah, well, I had one more thing I wanted to say. One reason that I think it's sort of particularly important for linguists to work against the pressure towards monolingualism is that as a field, as an academic field, we really ought to be very well placed to embody this embracing of multilingualism in our own work, in our research outputs and in the way that we communicate this research to a broader audience, but actually we're really not. And we have to acknowledge and work against the fact that linguistics and linguistic anthropology as fields are not immune to these monolingual biases and discourses, and there's a real lack of diversity in our own work, and we really have just such a long way to go to engage with scholarship from the point of view of speakers and signers and broader Indigenous perspectives on the role of language work and how it can really genuinely align with communities' self-determined goals for their own languages and language ecologies. And there's obviously a body of work on this already, which we can engage with. So work by Linda Tuhi-Wise-Smith, and in the Australian context, Martin Nakata, Tonya Stebbins, Travesera, Vicky Cousins have done hugely important work on this topic of decolonizing our research, but we have a long way to go.
I guess from my perspective as a Filipino linguist, so of course, because of the colonial history of the Philippines, this has so clearly shaped the linguistic landscape of the country and has contributed to, the lessening the diversity of the languages here and threatening the language ecology of the small-scale communities in the country. And this colonial mindset has pushed, towards this mindset of monolingualism, and you can actually see this happening currently with like the COVID-19 pandemic, where like information is only relayed mostly in English or Filipino, or at least the major languages of the country, but not in the smaller languages of the communities, which are actually the ones that are most vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the hopeful thing actually we've seen during this time is that the communities are actually aware of the importance of their languages, the importance of multilingualism, because they take their own initiative to translate materials into their local languages. And so I think that's one of the positive things that came out of this global health crisis. And as for the case of Ivatan, it clearly highlights, the importance of multilingualism and how, it's a hopeful story where empowering the community means, ensuring the maintenance of language ecology that underpins small-scale multilingualism. And just one quick note to highlight that when you talk about small-scale multilingualism, it's a really diverse field. And you can see this diversity of context even when you're talking about multilingualism. The context of Babuyan Claro, you see that it's less multilingual compared to Vanuatu, to Papua New Guinea, but that doesn't make it less interesting. Actually, when you look at the patterns of language use of these different small-scale communities, that's where the interesting things are.
Maybe I could just say something on that point. One of the things that Friederike and I discussed, and I also talked to Leslie Woods about, was ideas about how we could decolonize this new field of small-scale multilingualism. And I think in the end, talking about multilingualism and the value of having many languages in a place or in a nation is one of the ways we can work towards that. And as Friederike was mentioning, particularly in settler colonial countries like Australia, you know, linguists who work with Indigenous communities like me and Jill have a particular role to try and raise awareness of the value of Indigenous languages. And I think what we're seeing in Australia is that there's actually much greater awareness these days in the general public about the value of Indigenous languages. And that's come mainly from Indigenous communities just doing a whole lot of work over the last few decades to revitalize their languages and to use them in various art forms like music in particular. And I think one thing that linguists have to do now is try and leverage that public support to get greater government support, because when you go up to places like Arnhem Land, where there's so many languages, there's just so little government support for them. And it's quite shocking considering, you know, how valued they are, you know, by people around the country. Yet when you go to places where people are still speaking them, there's very little support for them to continue doing that. So I think when you're working in your own country, that's something that you can do.
Yes, I saw that we just had 2 questions that came in, and I think we hopefully managed to partly answer one of them. I read it out. Classist, as Alex mentioned, is a deterrent to becoming multilingual in some societies, e.g. New Zealand. So what are some effective ways in which we could promote multilingualism? And I think, you know, all of us just tried to do that, and Ruth summed that up very clearly and succinctly. So unless somebody explicitly wishes to address this question, I think we consider it answered.
I'll mention something which is probably obvious, but we're living at the time of social media, which can be problematic for some aspects, and good and excellent, you know, social media and internet and in general, and so in order to promote multilingualism, it's of course there are many ways, and one solution is not enough. But I've seen that, you know, for instance, but probably we've done that, created groups, Facebook groups or something to promote, I mean, on one language or the community of one island and so on. So, and everybody's actually picking up on the idea of writing together in this group, sometimes in English, sometimes in Bislama, the Pidgin, the Creole, but more and more I see are writing messages in the vernacular languages, and it's kind of exciting. And this was not possible 25 years ago, right? I mean, it would have been so much harder. So I've seen that this is one way to make you know, the language diversity cool again.
Yes, thank you. And then we have a last question from Mary Walworth, and it's a real historical linguist question. We often discuss how linguistic diversity leads to multilingualism. How might multilingualism eventually drive linguistic diversification over time? I think this is a question that we could discuss for several hours, if not during an entire conference. Does anybody feel able to attempt a very brief answer?
I could say something short about it. As you mentioned, my current project, which I've just started, is about this. And I think the reason I wanted to look at it in more depth is because our ideas about this are very speculative at the moment. So we've talked about how the places we work celebrate diversity and see diversity as actually the bedrock of social harmony, rather than unity, as you see in nationalistic kind of ideologies. So I guess a lot of us have a feeling that that somehow lies behind it, that groups want to distinguish themselves from one another at various points in time. And this might sort of drive diversification. And I guess my sense also with the receptive multilingualism is that people are consciously differentiating the languages by not accommodating while they speak. So they're trying not to accommodate. And so I think this could also drive diversity. But we really don't know, and that's why I'm, I guess, looking at it from various perspectives, so historical reconstruction, psycholinguistics, and continuing this linguistic ethnography kind of work.
Maybe I'll add maybe a word. Hello, Mary. And this is indeed, as Friederike said, you know, like a whole field of study, your question, per se. But I can see how multilingualism is tied to linguistic diversity. As you said, we usually see how linguistic diversity leads to multilingualism, but you have well, you have one obvious pattern is that the more languages you speak and the more languages you hear, the more attuned your ear is to nuances of meanings, to nuances of pronunciations. A bit what we say when we in our societies promote, you know, education in many languages in school, and think it's great that the more languages you speak, the more children speak, the more they will actually be smarter, if you want, or have even higher understanding of language, even of their native language. And I think that works also in our in the Pacific, with people having sharp understanding or awareness of words meaning, changing their meaning. I was surprised that even people who are not literate in, you know, even some older speakers who have never attended school, they can actually explain to me that, oh, this word is actually a metaphor, or this word, you know, has three meanings. I could see how linguistic diversity, how their own exposure to multiple languages had made them so aware of two languages. Maybe it's just part of the question you're asking, or it's a big tangent. But I can see how the more language you speak, the more people are aware of new meaning coming up, or and sometimes I had spontaneous comments of people saying, "Hey, I hear the youngsters saying this word. It used to mean something else, and and it's changing its meaning." I mean, they are, you know, sort of born linguists in the Pacific. Thank you.
Yes. So the short answer is there is a long answer, which we cannot provide today, but there's very exciting research happening right now that aims to contribute to it. But I think we all agree that the answer of this question, and, you know, of large questions as the evolution of language in general, can only be answered by paying more attention to small-scale linguistic communities. And these communities have for a long time just been seen as dots on the map, so as isolated monolingual groups that make up diversity. And only now we start understanding the complex entanglement, multiple connections, mobility, and multilingualism. And all of us are involved in shaping this emerging field. And I would like to end this roundtable by reminding everybody that there is another roundtable on small-scale multilingualism coming up next week, looking at Africa, the Black Atlantic, and Amazonia, but also to share with you the news that there is a follow-up conference for the first conference on the typology of small-scale multilingualism that was organized 2 years ago in Lyon by Nina Dobrushina, Olesja Kanina, and Brigitte Parkendorf. And we're organizing a virtual conference in Helsinki, Small-Scale Multilingualism 2, that will take place from August 16 to 18, 2021. And more details will be available online very soon. So just Google Small-Scale Multilingualism Helsinki in a couple of days, and hopefully you will find our conference information and call for papers there. And with this, I hand over to Amina for the concluding remarks.
Thank you, Friederike. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ruth and Jill, Christina, Christian, and Alex. It's been such an exciting and fascinating roundtable. And I'm very happy that we're going to discuss this question of multilingualism next week as well. It will be at 4 o'clock for the audience, so Paris time. So please be there with us, and thank you all in the audience for interacting so interestingly and nicely in the live chat. We will add a few links below the video so that you can follow them, and they will be linked to what has been discussed in the roundtable today. So many thanks again, and see you all next week on our YouTube channel. Thank you.